Nancy didn't leave because she was fearless. She left because staying required a kind of strength she no longer had. The email arrived on an ordinary afternoon, quiet, unassuming, sitting unread among spam and newsletters. An overseas hotel position. Singapore, in-room dining, competitive pay, post-pandemic opening. She reread the offer until the words blurred. Opportunity of a lifetime, they said. But what no one mentioned was how opportunity often arrives when you're most broken, when you don't trust yourself to choose joy anymore, so you choose motion instead. That night, Nancy lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining a life where she no longer woke up thinking of him. The thought terrified her, and yet staying terrified her more. He had been her first, not just in love, but in belief. They grew up learning adulthood together, making promises that felt solid because nothing had ever tested them before. When the pandemic arrived, it brought fear, distance, silence. Conversations became strained, reassurances felt hollow. They broke up gently, painfully, with the kind of words people use when they want to keep a door open. Maybe someday. Nancy held on to those two words like a lifeline. Then one quiet evening she saw the photos, a wedding, a smile she recognized, a future she was never invited to. That was the moment her heart finally accepted what her mind had avoided. Some endings don't come with closure, only proof. Nancy thought grief was tied to places, to streets, cafes, shared routines. She learned she was wrong. Grief packed lightly, it followed her across oceans. It settled into airplane seats beside her, lingered in unfamiliar hotel rooms, echoed in moments of silence she hadn't learned how to fill yet. She carried it with her into Singapore. Singapore greeted Nancy with heat and motion. The air felt heavier than she expected, thick with humidity and unfamiliar scents, food stalls, rain-soaked pavement, something metallic she couldn't name. The airport buzzed with efficiency. People moved with purpose, dragging luggage, speaking languages she recognized only in fragments. No one lingered, and somehow that comforted her. For the first time in years, Nancy felt invisible in the best way. No one here knew her story. No one associated her with a past she was trying to loosen her grip on. She was just another arrival, temporary, replaceable, unremarkable. She told herself that was freedom. During her first taxi ride into the city, she watched skyscrapers rise against the sky like polished promises. Everything looked intentional, planned, successful. She wondered if a person could become like that too, constructed carefully enough that the cracks no longer showed. That night, alone in her small rented room, she unpacked slowly. Each folded shirt felt symbolic, like she was placing pieces of her old life into a new shape. She didn't cry. She took a shower, let the water run hot against her back, and whispered to herself, "This is where I start again." Her first day at Marina Bay Sands felt unreal. The hotel wasn't just a building, it was an ecosystem. Polished floors reflected light so cleanly it almost hurt to look at. The ceilings stretched high, making her feel smaller than she already did. Everything smelled faintly of citrus and professionalism. Nancy clutched her orientation folder like a lifeline. In-room dining was fast-paced and unforgiving. Orders came in non-stop. Special requests, allergies, VIP instructions. She memorized routes, room numbers, elevator timings, service etiquette. She made mistakes, corrected them, learned quickly. Work demanded everything from her, and she gave it willingly. Because when she focused on trays and tickets and timing, her mind had no space to wander back to what she had lost. Her supervisors noticed her dedication. Her co-workers appreciated her reliability. Compliments came quietly. Nancy absorbed them without celebration. She didn't need praise, she needed distraction, and work gave her exactly that. By the end of each shift, Nancy's feet ached and her shoulders burned. Her body carried exhaustion like a second uniform. She welcomed it. She returned home each night with the same routine, shoes off by the door, shower, bed, no scrolling, no music, no messages that lasted too long. Silence filled the room. Sometimes, as she lay staring at the ceiling, memories tried to surface. His voice, his laughter, the version of herself that once believed love was enough. She shut them down immediately. Crying required energy she didn't have. Healing, she decided, could wait. Sleep became her refuge. Dreams were mercifully empty, and in that quiet repetition, Nancy survived. Iser entered Nancy's life the way warmth enters a cold room, softly at first, then all at once. They worked in neighboring departments, crossing paths often enough that greetings turned into conversations. Isa had a laugh that filled spaces and a way of speaking that made people feel instantly familiar. She noticed things when Nancy skipped meals, when her shoulders drooped a little lower after long shifts. "You're working too hard," Isa said one afternoon, handing her a bottle of water like it was a peace offering. Nancy smiled politely, just adjusting. But Isa didn't let her disappear into professionalism. She asked about home, about food preferences, about what Nancy missed most. And without meaning to, Nancy began answering honestly. It felt strange, letting someone know her without knowing how long they'd stay. Isa was the one who admitted she had pushed Nancy to apply for the Singapore job because she believed she needed it. Not for the resume, for herself. "You needed to leave," Isa said simply. "Sometimes staying breaks us more." That night, Nancy realized she had laughed without forcing it. The sound startled her. Nancy first noticed Sanje not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. In a kitchen full of movement and noise, he worked with quiet precision. He spoke when necessary, listened more than he talked, and carried himself with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. Their interactions were brief, professional, orders relayed, instructions clarified, but Nancy noticed how he always met her eyes when he spoke, how he never rushed his words, even during peak hours. He didn't linger, he didn't pry, and that, she realized, made him easy to be around. She didn't think of him outside work, didn't wonder about his life or imagine conversations beyond what was required. He was simply part of the rhythm of her days, reliable, steady, distant, safe. Distance had become Nancy's preferred language. It allowed her to exist without explaining herself, without expectations, without the risk of being misunderstood. And Sanje seemed fluent in it too. They shared quiet moments between tasks, standing side by side without pressure to fill the silence. There was comfort in that, the kind that didn't demand vulnerability but didn't shut it out either. Nancy liked that he never asked questions she wasn't ready to answer, that he accepted the version of her that showed up to work and nothing more. Sometimes she wondered if he was like her, someone who carried unspoken stories beneath the surface, but she never asked. Some distances weren't meant to be crossed, not yet, and so their worlds overlapped just enough to feel familiar without being threatening. Isa's birthday didn't feel like something Nancy could decline. "It's not a big thing," Isa said, smiling in that way that made refusals feel unnecessary. "Just food, music, and people who survived the week." Nancy told herself she would stay for an hour. The place was warm and crowded, filled with voices overlapping each other, laughter spilling freely. Music played louder than she was used to, and for once the noise didn't feel intrusive. It felt alive. Sanje was there. He stood near the edge of the room, drink in hand, observing rather than participating. When their eyes met, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that felt oddly reassuring. Nancy reached for a beer, then another. She hadn't planned to drink much, but the heaviness she carried loosened with each sip, and for the first time in a long while. She let herself sink into the moment. She laughed. She danced awkwardly without care. Isa pulled her into conversations she normally would have avoided. For a brief stretch of time, Nancy wasn't the woman running from her past. She was just present. It happened slowly, a question asked too kindly, a memory triggered too easily, a wall lowered too far. Nancy found herself talking, really talking, about love, about endings, about how the world seemed to move on faster than she could. Her voice trembled as she spoke his name. "I thought we'd find our way back," she admitted, staring into her drink. "I thought love was enough." The words tasted bitter once spoken aloud. She felt exposed, fragile, unguarded. Tears blurred her vision and she made no effort to stop them. There was no dramatic breakdown, just quiet unraveling. And through it all, Sanje listened, not as someone waiting to respond, but as someone absorbing her pain with care. When it was time to leave, Nancy realized the room was spinning. "I think I had too much," she muttered, embarrassed. Sanje didn't tease her, didn't scold. He simply stepped closer, steadying her without touching her arm. "I'll walk you home," he said. The night air was cool, grounding. They walked side by side, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Nancy talked less now. The words had run out. Sanje stayed quiet too. There was comfort in that silence, in knowing she didn't need to fill it. When they reached her place, Nancy paused. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for the walk, but for everything unspoken." Sanje nodded. "Any time." He waited until she was safely inside before turning away. That night, Nancy realized something had shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. Nancy woke with a dull ache behind her eyes and a heavier one in her chest. For a moment she lay still, letting the ceiling come into focus. The memories of the night before returned slowly, laughter, music, tears, Sanje's calm presence beside her. She groaned softly and buried her face in the pillow. Embarrassment crept in first. She rarely drank that much, rarely allowed herself to unravel in front of others. The thought of having cried about her past, about him, made her stomach twist. But beneath the embarrassment was something else. Relief. She hadn't been dismissed, or pitied, or hurried along. Sanje had simply listened. Like her pain was allowed to exist without explanation. As she got ready for work, Nancy caught her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes looked tired, but clearer somehow. She took a deep breath. Whatever had happened last night hadn't broken her. Work felt different that day. The corridors were the same, the routines unchanged. But Nancy found herself more aware of her surroundings, of small details she usually ignored. When she passed by the kitchen, Sanje looked up. Their eyes met for a brief second. No awkwardness, no discomfort, just a quiet understanding. They didn't mention the night before, they didn't need to. Their conversations remained light about work, schedules, small annoyances, but there was an ease now that hadn't existed before. A softness beneath the professionalism. Nancy realized she wasn't guarding herself as tightly, and that realization scared her. Days passed, then weeks. A new rhythm formed between them, unspoken, unplanned. But steady, they crossed paths during breaks, exchanged small smiles, shared observations about long shifts and difficult guests. Sometimes they walked part of the way home together, talking about nothing important at all. Nancy found herself looking forward to these moments, not in the restless way she once associated with love, but in a quiet, grounding way. Sanje never pushed, never rushed. He was simply there, and for the first time in a long while. Nancy allowed herself to believe that healing didn't always come in dramatic moments. Sometimes, it arrived gently through consistency, kindness, and shared silence. Nancy didn't realize how starved she had been for listening until she experienced it without conditions. Sanje had a way of paying attention that felt rare. When she spoke, he didn't glance at his phone or interrupt to offer solutions. He simply listened, fully, patiently, as if her words deserved space. They often sat during short breaks, sharing quiet moments between the rush of work. Sometimes Nancy spoke about trivial things, a difficult guest, a dish she had learned to like, the strange comfort she found in walking the city alone. Other times, her thoughts wandered deeper. She found herself speaking about her fears, how she worried she might never feel whole again, how love had once defined her sense of self and left her unsure of who she was without it. Sanje never told her what to feel. He didn't try to fix her. He listened. And in being heard, Nancy felt herself slowly piecing back together. Nancy noticed it one afternoon when she caught herself scanning the kitchen for him without thinking. The realization unsettled her. She told herself it was gratitude, comfort, the relief of finding someone who understood without demanding explanations. But it felt like more. She noticed how his presence calmed her, how his absence left a faint emptiness she didn't want to acknowledge, how laughter came easier when he was near. The things she once guarded against, connection, closeness, were quietly returning. Nancy tried to dismiss the feelings. She reminded herself she wasn't ready, that she had only just begun to heal. Yet the heart rarely asks permission, and hers was awakening. The weight became too heavy to carry alone. One evening, after a long shift, Nancy asked Sanje if they could talk. Voice betrayed her nerves. They stood outside the hotel, city lights flickering around them. For a moment, neither spoke. "I need to be honest," Nancy finally said. "I don't expect anything, I just can't keep pretending." Her words came slowly, carefully, confessing the feelings she hadn't planned, hadn't invited, but could no longer deny. She waited for rejection, for disappointment, for distance. Instead, Sanje looked at her with an expression that mirrored her vulnerability. "I feel the same," he said quietly. The relief was overwhelming, so was the fear. For a moment they stood suspended in possibility, hope blooming where neither had intended it to grow. For a brief moment the world softened. Nancy didn't smile right away when Sanje said he felt the same. Instead, she exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath for months without realizing it. The relief settled in her chest, warm and frightening all at once. They didn't touch. They didn't rush forward into declarations or promises. What they shared in that moment was quieter than that, an understanding that what they felt was real, even if they didn't know where it belonged. They talked that night, not about the future, but about the present, about how neither of them had planned for this, about how unexpected comfort had turned into something deeper. Nancy felt seen, not idealized, not rescued, but understood. For the first time since her heartbreak, love didn't feel like something she was chasing, it had simply arrived. The truth came carefully. Sanje didn't blurt it out, he didn't hide it either. "There's something you should know," he said one evening, his voice heavier than usual. They sat across from each other, the city humming softly around them. He told her about his family, about traditions, about expectations carried across generations. And finally, about the marriage that had already been arranged, a commitment made long before her, long before Singapore, long before he'd allowed himself to hope for anything else. Nancy listened, heart sinking with every word. There was no anger, no sense of betrayal, only the quiet devastation of realizing that love had arrived at the wrong time. She understood immediately. That somehow hurt more. They cried together, not loudly, not desperately. Just tears that fell because something beautiful was being lost before it could begin. Nancy realized then that grief didn't always come from endings caused by cruelty or neglect. Sometimes it came from circumstances no one had chosen. Sanje apologized, though she knew he had nothing to apologize for. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. She nodded, swallowing her own pain. Neither of them was wrong. Neither of them was free. And that truth settled between them heavy, final and impossibly sad. They talked long into the night, voices low, as if raising them might fracture what little peace remained. There were moments when the temptation to escape felt overwhelming, to choose each other recklessly, to believe that love once found should never be denied. But love, they both knew, was not just about desire. Sanje spoke of his family, of promises made in faith, of a mother who had waited years for his return, of a life that had already been mapped out before he had known better. Nancy listened with a heart that understood too well what it meant to honor people you loved, even at your own expense. They realized then that choosing each other would mean choosing guilt, choosing pain for others who had done nothing wrong, so they chose what hurt less in the long run. They chose restraint. Ending something that had barely begun felt cruel in its own way. They didn't mark the moment with finality, no dramatic goodbye, no last embrace meant to be remembered forever. Instead, they spoke softly, acknowledging what they had shared without pretending it had been small. Sanje thanked her for trusting him with her heart. Nancy thanked him for loving her without asking her to become someone else. They agreed to let the connection go before it grew roots too deep to remove, and in that decision there was dignity. Nancy said thank you, not out of politeness, but with reverence. She thanked him for showing her that she could love again after believing she never would, for reminding her that her heart wasn't broken beyond repair, only waiting. She told him that loving him, even briefly, had given her back something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. Sanje listened, eyes heavy with emotion, and for the first time, Nancy didn't wish for a different ending. In the days that followed, Sanje requested a transfer to another branch. He didn't explain much. He didn't need to. Distance, they both understood, was an act of kindness. They crossed paths less, then not at all. Nancy felt the ache of his absence, but it was cleaner now, less confusing, easier to carry. Some love stays by leaving. Life continued. Nancy worked. She rested. She learned to be alone without feeling abandoned by herself. She still missed him sometimes, but the pain no longer felt like proof of loss. It felt like evidence of growth. She no longer believed love only came once, or that timing defined worth. Some love arrives not to stay, but to heal. And as Nancy stood by the window of her small Singapore apartment, watching the city breathe below her, she realized she wasn't afraid of the future anymore. Her heart had learned how to open again, and that, she knew, was enough. The end.